Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is May 16th, 2019, and this is episode 138. Politicos is a BC politics podcast. Tell us what you think of the show by leaving us a review or get at us on social media. Most importantly, help us build the show by throwing us a couple bucks a month at patreon.com/politicos.
I'm Scott Lindebom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, money laundering across BC and misconduct in the BC legislature. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. If you ever have feedback for us or we get things wrong, email us both at podcast@politicos.ca. First up, let's talk about dirty homes and dirty cars and everything BC is going to do to fix it all immediately. We teased last week that a couple reports dropped just before we recorded on money laundering, and they were thick, and so we didn't have time to read them right away. But let's start with this finance minister's report, Combating Money Laundering in BC Real Estate. How bad is it, Scott?
Well, it's a little hard to say, mostly because, well, money laundering is kind of by definition designed to be hard to track. But nevertheless, the academics that worked on this report gave it their best go, and they estimate that roughly $7.4 billion was laundered in BC in 2018.
And about 72% of that was real estate alone. It did also, interestingly, look more nationwide, and across the country it found an estimate of $46.7 billion across Canada.
But even that is just very much an estimate. They had a rather complicated what's called the gravity model. They can read all about in Appendix G, I believe it is, of the report. But basically they tried to estimate kind of, okay, if this is what we think kind of global money laundering is and how much there are in other countries based on like how close we are to those countries and how much like cultural similarities and economic trade happens between them, what the rough estimates are. So it's an interesting way to go about it, but like it's not like they counted up all the suspicious money transactions and came up, oh, it's 7.4 billion in BC.
Yeah, there was one interesting graph that went around that a lot of people commented on that compared the various provinces on this gravity model. And Alberta actually had more money laundering than BC by that graph, I think about 10 billion.
Yeah,
so did Ontario, which is a bigger economy.
It's because they're bigger economies. So the model just figures, well, bigger economies have a proportionate share of money laundering, so they just have more money laundering because they have more everything.
Nevertheless, we have a number for BC now, with some error bars, but
it's stated to be around 5% of GDP, which is both a lot, and what also surprised me was kind of what the international average is. And once again, these are very much guesses, informed guesses, but guesses nonetheless.
And that's really interesting.
It's also about 5% of like global GDP is just money laundering.
Yeah, the fact that the global average is 5% and we hit that is strange. You kind of, maybe it's a naive assumption about the world, but
based on how the model is, it's very likely we'd be roughly in the same bound.
Yeah.
Just because that's one of the major inputs into it. So yeah, like it's in some ways like terrifying that it's like 5% of our economy. On the other hand, it's a little reassuring that it's kind of just around what like the global average is and not like way out like 5 times what the normal amount is.
Mm-hmm. The report uses these difficult to estimate kind of numbers to still try to look at, what effect would this amount of money laundering, particularly in real estate, actually do to prices. And the figure they come up with is about 5% of transactions in real estate resulted from money laundering investment, and that this was sufficient to have raised housing prices, but again, they still can't say how much.
Yeah, they take an estimate based on, okay, if we have $7.8 billion and figure it's probably roughly going to match like what normal people have in their assets, maybe a little more, like wealthy normal people, not like, non-criminal wealthy people, just kind of match their general portfolio outlook. And then from there, figure it's going to be roughly that amount of the real estate transactions can be attributed to that. And then they do some complicated modeling based off some estimates of how elastic real estate prices are, but based on American data, because we don't have good Canadian data on that. So with all of these multiple error bars, they kind of come up to an estimate somewhere between 3.7 and 7.5%, with kind of 5 as being the most likely number. So, it's something. It's housing is like 5% more than it would be otherwise, but some people I think have been wanting like this to be the answer to the affordability crisis, and tackling money laundering is good just because money laundering is bad and we should get rid of it, but $1 million house becoming a $950,000 house doesn't really solve the affordability challenges.
I think this and the German report, though, also do emphasize that the effect of money laundering in real estate is not likely evenly distributed. So there is some suspicion, I think, from that it might be disproportionately more in Metro Vancouver, just as it is in any hot real estate market.
It's a little hard to say.
It's still, again,
it's
hard
very
to
much
quantify.
Speculative on that. They do kind of quantify it a bit by, or attempt to quantify by type of housing. So like there's a sign it's more likely to be in new builds, and that it's had a greater impact on prices on single-family detached rather than condos, just because that section of the market is less elastic.
But like you say, there's so little data available to measure this in very concrete ways, and that brings us to the recommendations of the Finance Ministry's report, which is basically a lot of it is around just getting better data, regulatory improvements, and it highlights that the enhanced beneficial ownership disclosure that's already forthcoming from the NDP government is really good. Getting the feds to do a lot more and getting other provinces to do a lot more is also key. And that, of course, will be harder given there's a federal election and other provinces may or may not see this as urgent as British Columbians do at this point. And then just efforts to data share and a lot of just, we need to have a better understanding of this problem.
Yes.
And of course, the finance minister is eager to implement all of these changes, at least the ones she can, right away.
One other thing that's probably worth mentioning here is when they attempted to model the flows, most of the money, based on their models, coming from the U.S., followed by Northern Europe, Western Europe, then Western Asia, East Asia, and South America in that order, and kind of goes against the popular idea out there that this is all like East Asian money. So,
like, the U.S. is our biggest trading partner,
yes,
by far, because it's convenient and right there, and it's a giant economy. So,
and they have higher crime rates than us, so that will also drive more of it. But yeah, there's definitely been some kind of xenophobic, to say the least, ideas out there about where the source of money's coming from, and I think this would hopefully put that to rest, although it probably won't.
Well, on the other side, we have the second phase of the German report. This is the Peter German's follow-up to the one we talked about last year. On this report, Turning the Tide, he talks about real estate, luxury vehicle sales, and horse racing. Let's just tackle horse racing first. Apparently, not much money laundering happening there, because it's just a tiny industry that no one really cares about.
Although there's apparently some happening just in like the buying and selling of horses.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a place that money laundering could happen, just there's not enough assets. So when you have $100,000 cars or several $100,000 or several $1 million houses, those are much more valuable to flip large amounts of money than, I don't know, what's a horse worth? 10 grand? I don't know.
I have no. You're the one who grew up on a farm. Like,
we didn't have horses or any livestock.
Yeah, but I grew up in the suburbs. I have even less idea of what a horse goes for.
Real estate was the big thing here, though, although luxury cars did have some very weird stories coming out. In real estate, again, it was poor quality data. One thing that jumped out at me was that German found that 17 to 21% of residential transactions are just cash buys. Now, most of those are probably legitimate. Like, people just, I guess, have hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars in assets that they can just sink into a home.
Well, if you had a home for a long time in the city, yes, you have that amount of assets.
But 1 in 5 purchases being straight up like that seemed a bit high. I don't know what it should be in a normal market situation, but the other thing they really get into is just the number of ways mortgages were being used very dodgily to skirt money laundering rules. So there would be a lot of, I think it was the uninsured mortgages or unlicensed ones. I forget the exact terminology, but essentially the dodgier mortgages were being used as a way to...
The ones you don't get from RBC, kind of like the, more informal, I guess, or...
The Bank of the Hells Angels?
Yeah, not the big banks mortgages.
And so there's a lot of recommendations, of course, to tighten that up and try and control a bit more of that. And again, just get better data so we know what's happening. But then we get into this luxury car market, and there's just so much bizarre things. So one of the quotes in here is they talk about, we heard stories from dealers who describe gangsters bringing bags of money into dealerships to purchase cars. The dealers then had to transport the cash to their bank, where it was accepted without hesitation. One dealer described large cash purchases occurring on a monthly basis. The other half of this is, so someone buys these luxury cars in BC, but then they're shipping them to China, which doesn't seem profitable, but apparently you can make a bunch of that. And then they're claiming the PST refund because it's sold overseas, so they shouldn't have to pay provincial sales tax. And this cost the province over $50 million that basically went to people who are laundering cars out of the province. And I think that was one of the flags of how has this been happening, of just shipping containers full of Ferraris and things going out of Port of Vancouver and over to China.
I think there was 3,000 over per year or something was the number, which 3,000 is on one hand a lot.
10 a day.
Yeah. On the other hand, that's not that much compared to the container volume in the port here. It's not like there's just lots of luxury cars just sitting by the port.
Sure. It's still weird.
It's weird. And I don't think they're doing it for profit. I think they're doing it because it's, you can get cash on the other side from it.
So the focus of the German report is just on this. Why weren't people asking the right questions at the right times? Why were people walking around with $5, $10, $100,000 in cash on their person and no one stopped to go, is that, what are you doing with that giant bag of cash? And I think this is what's motivating some of the NDP's asset forfeiture stuff, because they go, well, if you have that much cash, you must be a criminal, which is problematic for its own reasons. But I also get,
not great.
I get Germans' arguments here of you shouldn't have that much cash in cash.
Speaking of that, in the other report, one of the things that was raised was using unexplained wealth orders, which basically you have a bunch of wealth there, can you explain it? And if not, let's take it, which actually had a lower threshold than even a civil asset forfeiture thing, which doesn't seem great. The threshold to trigger was higher, but
yeah, it's
it's still the civil asset forfeiture stuff's pretty sketchy on civil rights levels, and maybe we shouldn't be looking for something that has even lower bars than that.
Yeah, I think the unexplained wealth orders are used in the UK and a couple other jurisdictions, and that's why BC is eyeing them now. But you're right, the BCCLA and others are already kind of raising flags about this of guys, do your job. And that's one of the things German highlights in his report is the police don't seem to be acting, track these down, or do issues. It was released in one of the early chapters that there wasn't anyone looking at this for a while. No RCM, from the federal RCMP at least. And so getting police resources to actually investigate this, do the work, prosecute it properly, and not cheat by just seizing people's money seems like the necessary next step.
Yeah, and if there's $7 billion, even if you capture 1% of it, you can probably still actually just pay for the law enforcement that way. I mean, the seizing stuff to pay for law enforcement has some perverse incentives, which aren't great, but there shouldn't be a resource limitation here is what I'm getting at.
But one thing you can do with all that money you take in by catching the bad guys who have laundered all this money is spend it on a big public inquiry, which it was announced this week we're getting one, finally, after months and a couple years, I think, of people calling for it. David Eby did announce earlier this week there's going to be a full public inquiry into this. They've appointed BC Supreme Court Justice Austin Cullen to head the committee. They've been given terms of reference to investigate gaming and horse racing, real estate, financial institutions and money services, in particular unregulated entities who provide, quote, banking-like services, corporations, notably shell companies, trusts, and anyone else who might be in the purpose of money laundering, luxury goods, and professional services like legal and accounting firms. The public inquiry is given the power to subpoena witnesses, demand testimony, access a lot of records. So it's got some teeth, and it will be able to generate something. And it seems like we'll get a report in what's honestly probably a reasonable amount of time for a public inquiry of this scale to get an initial report in 18 months when the interim will come out. And the final report will be 2 years after the order, which is conveniently just a few months before the next election.
5 months, I believe it.
Yeah, it's going to be May 2021, with the election being held in October.
Yeah, before we started recording, you were mentioning how you thought it was surprising that it took this long to get to this, but I can kind of see why they weren't super keen to go full speed ahead. Just, money laundering didn't start in 2001, and there's chance that this could also implicate the previous New Democrat government in this. And public inquiries can, just turn up a lot of stuff that can embarrass all parties.
Well, one other thing that came out in the announcement is that they've secured the full cooperation of the federal government. And I don't know if there was hesitation there, but if there was, that may have been a bit of mud to slow the whole works down. No government would want to be officially against investigating money laundering, but trying to negotiate the cooperation of the federal government may have just been a matter of time, or maybe they were always on board and I'm just idly speculating here. But this will be really interesting to see where it goes. It seems like no one's really against the idea. I mean, once again, it fuels Twitter mobs of haha, but until the report comes out, we won't know how bad it is. But based on how the Charbonneau Commission went in Quebec, I'm optimistic. I mean, the worst case scenario is it comes out with not much that we need to do, or maybe that's the best case. The other side is, it comes out with tons of stuff. In either case, we're cleaning up money laundering.
Yeah, it's definitely good to do it on that front. I mean, be a little more reassured if David Eby and several other New Democrats didn't seem giddy every time they talk about this, because it's a chance to bash the other party. Be nice if it was a little less politicized and stuff like just massively overstating the effects of the money laundering in their press release definitely doesn't help with that, where they talked about how it could cause up to 20%, which for people who have been following along here, that's not in the report at all. So just deceptive stuff like that isn't great, and kind of does add it feels like it's more politicizing it than it needs to be.
I don't disagree. I mean, governments are going to use the creation of such a committee or inquiry as such a moral boost, or you have a Supreme Court justice chairing it, and I trust him to be independent of the partisan affiliations, and so we'll see where it goes. The Liberals didn't have a great track record, and neither did the 90s NDP, to be frank, but hopefully we can dig up the dirt, figure out where to go, and move the province in a direction where maybe we get down to only 3% of our GDP is money laundering instead of 5%.
Hashtag goals. Moving on to segment 2, Clear Lens. Former Chief Justice of Canada, Beverly McLachlin, released her report into the alleged misconduct at the legislature. So back in November of last year, I believe it was, might have been October, the clerk of the House and the sergeant at arms got suspended. Nobody knew why for a while. Then the speaker came out and said, oh, nope, there's actually all this misconduct, released a report alleging a bunch of stuff from wood splitters to overcharging for travel to buying
truckload of alcohol.
Truckloads of alcohol, purchasing Guy Fawkes mustard. There's a lot of weird stuff, and we did a whole episode going through the more salacious aspects of that. But as a follow-up, the LAMC, the Legislative Affairs Management Committee, decided to bring in a former Chief Justice, because apparently that's just what you do now, is get former Chief Justice or former Supreme Court Justices to do everything in Canada, to look into it and report on whether or not there's any misconduct by the clerk, Craig James, or the Sergeant at Arms, Gary Lenz. And earlier today, the report was released.
Yeah, LAMC received the report, I think, last week and released it this week. Before we get into the misconduct allegations, McLachlin fills in a bunch of the background and talks about Darryl Pleck as a speaker specifically and his approach to this, which I don't think she was very glowing on. She says, quote, "It's not entirely clear why the speaker did not bring his concerns to the attention of the clerk and sergeant at arms forthwith, as one would expect a supervising officer in any event before taking the dramatic action of having them publicly expelled from the grounds of Legislative Assembly building." She goes on to say, "What emerges from the evidence is that the speaker viewed the matters that concerned him through the lens of a police investigation and criminal prosecution rather than the lens of an administrator. He focused on an investigatory line of inquiry at the expense of his duty to ensure that the affairs of the Legislative Assembly were properly administered on a current basis. In other words, he was too busy playing cop than being the, HR boss that he effectively was supposed to be."
The speaker's effectively the CEO of the legislature. So, yeah, that's a fair point on that. It's also worth noting here that McLachlin's terms of reference were to look into the administrative matters here. So the potential criminal aspects, for example, were beyond her purview.
Well, and we had talked about when, I think it was Darryl Pleckis' second report came out, which was like his response to the clerk and sergeant at arms response to Pleckis' original allegations. Pleckis outlined how he and Alan Mullen, the deputy he'd hired, his special advisor, that everyone was kind of curious about where he came from, were doing drive-bys of like Craig James's house to take photos, secret photos of the wood splitter, which I think we mocked as kind of a Blues Brothers-esque situation.
In fact, my favorite Photoshop of the episode art was the Blues Brothers one of those two.
Which is not up right now because I'm trying to avoid copyright infringements. But it was kind of notable at the time that this is a weird action, and I think now it's kind of been properly pointed out that his job, Darryl Pleckis, should have been to just deal with this directly and not try to build a weird police case. His background is as a professor of criminology, so he probably has that thinking in mind, and if you get elected as a public official, as a member of the Legislative Assembly, you don't always come from the HR world or world where you understand your role as a boss. Nevertheless, that was kind of the side show of the main report, which goes essentially line by line through the allegations Pleckis had made and tries to determine whether misconduct occurred in a formal sense or if people followed the rules as they were being interpreted. And while things seem weird, I guess they're not illegal or illicit, at least.
Not against the legislature's rules.
And that came up a lot. For the most part, Gary Lenz was entirely cleared of any misconduct. There were a few places where McLachlin noted, "It's weird that he bought that way, but it seems like that's how things are done. I don't think they should probably be done that way."
But it's not clearly against the rules of the legislature.
And even for Craig James, on a number of points, he was found to not have committed misconduct as well. Things like the purchasing of electronics. We talked about the Bose headphones he had bought and some of the other, even buying the wood splitter, the process to purchase it, were all found to be not misconduct, at least.
Yes. There was a program in place to require emergency preparedness stuff, and that the wood splitter fell under it. Even if there were some questions about why the committee responsible for that just approved a blanket $65,000 budget for that and didn't really go into the larger items in there, despite the fact that there's supposed to be, I think, anything over $5,000 supposed to have its own process with it. But so there's a bunch of stuff like that where it's like, yeah, it does follow the rules as they were laid out, but like it's kind of a little weird, even if they did get formal approval to purchase stuff within that $65,000 allotment, and the wood splitter was fine to purchase. Now, it wasn't fine to take to Craig James's house. And that brings us to the various misconduct allegations that McLachlin did find have merit.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, keeping the wood splitter and trailer on his personal property for a year basically meant the Legislative Assembly could not have used them in an emergency, and given there was evidence he had used it at his personal property, and somehow the trailer was involved in renovating his bathroom, it came up, that was clearly misconduct. It was not good. Similarly, one of the biggest surprises for me was that Mr. James was actually found of engaging in misconduct on this truckload of alcohol situation. Now, I'm not surprised that effectively stealing a truckload of alcohol from the Legislative Assembly's budget stores constitutes misconduct, but the allegation was so hearsay and, so-and-so told me this story from there that it didn't seem like it could pan out. But I guess McLachlin found enough evidence that alcohol did go missing. They just couldn't account for how much, that she could pin it on James as misconduct. She also found that his purchase of suits were misconduct because, while he claimed they were as part of a new uniform, they didn't match, so they weren't uniform. Also, the new uniform program was speculative and not really in place, so it didn't make any sense to buy suits before there was a new policy.
Also, the suits or uniform budget in general falls under the Sergeant at Arms budget, so why was he buying them?
And then there's also misconduct found on some of the benefits packages that Mr. James created. These were some of the more complicated allegations.
Yeah, I think the meat of the report actually goes into the details of those. Because, it was rather complicated with past policies from the 80s and, who fell under them and and there's a whole page or two just with trying to ascertain whether or not in 2012, when some of these policies were coming up, what Craig James was involved in their creation or not, despite having a clear conflict of interest in there. She ends up concluding that, yes, there is sufficient evidence. But I think that's the details of that are probably a little more in the weeds than we need to go into.
At the end of her report, McLachlin outlined 6 final observations that I think are the key takeaways for LAMC going forward. And they're things like there's a lack of clarity regarding who has authority for administrative matters at the Legislative Assembly. Essentially, it is kind of as Darryl Plecas pointed out, like when he walked in, he didn't know what's going on, which is fair. He was new to the office as Speaker. And he just kind of deferred to Craig James as clerk, which seemed reasonable, except there needs to be some more accountability.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff also just wasn't really policies in place for. It's not just, there apparently isn't a policy for senior legislative officers' travel. So apparently it just kind of works off of, we'll follow what the MLA policy is. But a lot of stuff like that where, maybe they should actually have a policy and formalize a lot of these informal practices.
Yeah, same goes for expenses that appear to be both business and personal in nature, electronic devices that get used at home, travel expenses, as you mentioned, and the receipts on those.
Vacation time was another one.
And alcohol purchases, of course. How much alcohol should the legislature be purchasing? Where should it be kept? And who should be responsible when they don't drink it? So members of LAMC are going to have their work cut out for them trying to develop some detailed administrative policies to manage the spending. But I think what this, in a way, vindicates Plecas for is that there is a culture of entitlement in the Legislative Assembly's staff, that things are just kind of done this way, and a lot of the time can't be called misconduct because it doesn't officially break any rules. It's not best practice, to put it mildly.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be improvements made. And it vindicates a bit in that, misconduct was found, and by someone who is independent, not just in the reports that Plecas put together. On the flip side of that, though, half of the James allegations weren't found to be misconduct, and none of the ones against Lenz were, which maybe indicates an overzealousness on Plecas' part. So that's a 25% hit rate, which isn't great when you're hauling 2 senior people out of the legislature with a police escort.
I wouldn't say that he got everything wrong. I agree that it was definitely an overzealous report, and the language and rhetorical flourish of Darryl Plecas' reports is still unrivaled in anything I've read in Canadian politics for quite a while. And there are so many caveats in McLachlin's report of, all right, well, the rules don't technically allow this, but it seems like that's just what everyone's done. And in that kind of situation, it's not the rule that matters so much as the practice. And so we need a lot of change in the practice at the legislature. And so there's some value in Plecas raising those, even if it's not formal misconduct. Now, he treated them all pretty harshly, even though I think a few people tried to calculate up what would be the total cost of the spending. And if you take out some of the expense benefits, which were major six-figure payments, it was like expensive glasses of orange juice kind of situation. Like, you hate to see it, but in the grand scheme of things...
There was the, $1,000 sets of luggage, which was misconduct. We didn't mention that earlier. There's the suits, which I think added up to something like $2,500, which, it's not six figures, but it's not nothing either.
Mm-hmm. Following the release of this report, Craig James officially announced his retirement and resignation from the role of clerk, so he's no longer on paid administrative leave, but is officially no longer the clerk of the legislature. It was said he reached a, quote, non-financial settlement, which is a way, I guess, of him going away, agreeing not to sue the legislature because there's grounds that they could have fired him anyway, but it also tries to maybe stop further problems from arising.
Which I guess means he might not have to pay back the six figures that he got as part of the misconduct.
I imagine we'll never know the details of that settlement. What I do know is his statement is non-apologetic in the extreme. After saying the general, I've worked in the legislature for 40 years, I've made so many friends here, he goes on to say, but I've had enough. I have been publicly ridiculed and vilified. My family has been deeply hurt and continues to suffer humiliation. In an effort to end that, I have decided to retire and reach a settlement with the Legislative Assembly. And he goes on to talk about how many statements and documents and evidence he's given to the Legislative Assembly, yet they refuse to publish it. And if only those statements were released, he would be vindicated and the public would know the truth. Because, of course, we need another response to the allegations, to the response of the allegations and so forth. I mean, after the former Chief Justice looks at your documents?
It states in McLachlin's report that, no, she did review evidence from James and Lenz.
This will probably be the last we hear from Craig James, though.
Yeah, because it's hard to think of someone you'd want to try and, match reputations with less than Beverly McLachlin. Nobody is going to win that fight on the who's more credible.
Mm-hmm. On the other side, we have Gary Lenz, who remains suspended with pay. This report largely exonerates him. There's still some, maybe we should clean up the practices, but if he did follow the practice, you can't truly fault him for it, even though you want things done better. The one question remaining, though, is this is one of several investigations that have been ongoing into this whole affair. I think the key one we're really waiting on, which probably be the one we hear the least from, is the RCMP/special prosecutors that were appointed to investigate this on, I think, allegations we haven't heard yet.
Yeah, there's apparently some stuff that hasn't been released yet. And I'd be hard-pressed to see how you can make a criminal case if it doesn't even meet the lower standards of administrative misconduct. Because generally you don't have to prove those beyond a reasonable doubt. But, maybe there's something else that hasn't been discussed yet that's significantly more damning. But, yeah, from what we've seen here, there doesn't seem to be much of a case against Gary Lenz, but that obviously hasn't concluded yet either. I think Craig James is probably more likely to have legal trouble. But, yeah, this definitely won't be the last we'll be talking about this story.
Finally, for a third segment, I don't message. Jinny Sims, Minister of Citizen Services, is once again in the news for not having any messages. I think she'd previously gotten in trouble for...
almost exactly a year ago now, I believe, for using personal email rather than government email for government business, which is not FOI-able, which was bad because she's the minister who has FOI, Freedom of Information, under her portfolio, and in fact still does.
Yeah, I think the Liberals had FOI'd a specific set of emails and come back with nothing over the span of 3 months, which was really bad, and then she promised to do better, and then It came up again like a month later, and now a year later, it sounds like she is once again in hot water. So this time it's stemming from allegations that she instructed her constituency staff to use unconventional channels like iMessage, WhatsApp, and personal email for government business. I can maybe see some justification for that, given different groups, communities, constituencies might prefer certain apps, and it might just be a more effective way to communicate. But you have to still follow the FOI rules, and if you're using those, the personal email is unjustifiable in there. And so these allegations come from a letter that was sent by the lawyer of one of her former staff, Kate Gilly. I guess the other half of this set of allegations is that she's also been writing visa recommendation letters for Pakistani nationals. Now, that's not uncommon for, I imagine, an MLA or elected official to try to support a constituent.
I gather there's some issues about whether or not it had a ministerial letterhead on there, which generally isn't how these go. But there's also some allegations around whether or not there was a quid pro quo in relation to perhaps campaign donations. Not entirely sure, but there's basically suggests that it was about $10,000 may have exchanged hands, as well as that 3 of these individuals were on a security watch list.
It's not great.
No. Jinny Sims says she never saw the letters and that her staff just prepared them and she really had nothing to do with it.
That does sound like standard practice in a lot of cases. Staff would handle a lot of the bureaucracy and drafting those kind of letters and just sending them to sign off. But at some point, someone needs to, A, not accept bribes, and B, double check that the people you're endorsing are worthy of endorsement. Now, maybe people are unjustifiably on security lists.
At the very least, there should be some due diligence involved in this. And it doesn't seem to have happened.
So given this is the second, third time she's come under fire, and the BC Liberals spent a big chunk of their question periods this last week drilling into Jinny Sims for this.
Yeah, they got a copy of the letters, and they spent one day going after the FOI, and the following day going after the visa letters. And it seems fairly justifiable as a thing to go after, because, especially if a minister's already been in trouble for this once, skirting the rules around freedom of information is bad, and they should be held accountable, especially if they're the ones in charge of the FOI system. So the question, I guess, is, can she remain a minister? Will she be the first one to resign and out of John Horgan's cabinet?
That's the thing I wonder. I know Sims is fairly high profile within the NDP. She's a former member of parliament. She's within the Indo-Canadian community. She brings a lot to the party. And I get the sense that aside from not keeping records of things very well, she is rather competent in her role, but except apparently for the FOI aspect. But I struggle to see how someone who creates so many bad headlines for the party and for the government can really hold their place at the cabinet table for too long. Because, if I'm John Horgan, I don't want reporters asking me every day about this when I want to be talking about how the BC Liberals were corrupt, and the public inquiry is going to find that, even though we agreed it shouldn't be overly politicized.
Yeah, there are definitely also some reports that during question period, rather than the usual, partisans rallying behind their people, the clapping and banging and, all that stuff was rather muted to non-existent when she was defending herself in the House, which is reading tea leaves, but isn't a great sign of where she's standing within the party at the moment. Now, we should probably also mention that these are allegations raised by a former dismissed staffer, but there does seem to be some meat here and to them. So I think probably good chance she's out of cabinet.
Like I said, I have a hard time seeing the argument for keeping her in cabinet other than fealty or loyalty, purely that sort of, she's been a good soldier, let's try and help her weather this and keep her going, which I kind of hate to see because it's what's wrong with politics, and it's what makes people think governments and all politicians are corrupt when they can't own up to mistakes if they're made. But we'll see. Maybe this blows over in a couple weeks, or maybe Jinny Sims is quietly shuffled after the legislature rises for the spring. I don't think there's been a major cabinet shuffle since the NDP took office. There have been a couple minor changes, I believe. But maybe it's time.
Moving on to quick takes. After the Greens' victory in the by-election here in BC and Nanaimo, looks like they're doing well in the province in general. Nanos released their latest weekly tracking poll, and it has the Green Party up at 28% in the province of BC, just slightly behind within the margin of error of the Conservatives at 29%, and followed by the NDP at 25.7%, and the Liberals in a distant 14%.
What's really interesting looking at the graph of this over the past couple months is the Liberals are starting to tank in British Columbia, and it seems like that's largely going almost equally between the NDP and Greens, who have both risen at almost the same clip, in almost direct opposition to the Liberals. Now, the Conservatives are down a little bit as well. It starts to make things really unpredictable under a first-past-the-post system where you have maybe a few places the Greens are electable, but is that support evenly distributed? Same problem faces the NDP. The Liberals could face near wipeout again in BC. They drop down to 2 seats at their worst. Maybe the Conservatives win a lot of tight races. Maybe the NDP pick up a few. Just really puts the whole province as very unclear. Now, the standard caveats of any poll apply in that for the crosstab, I don't think we know the exact sample size and margin of error. So it might be that the Greens aren't actually surging, or it might be that the NDP isn't surging, or it might be that they're even higher. It looks like there's trends, and that starts to suggest a reality to it.
Yeah, and you could definitely find the narrative of, okay, Greens win another seat, they start looking like a more viable party, people are more willing to put their support there when in past they may have liked the Greens, but the viability question got in the way. So, you can definitely create a narrative out of this that makes sense. But yeah, whether or not that actually holds up and is maintainable between now and October is another question. But despite the fact that the NDP is picking up a bit, this isn't really great news for them, because the seats the Greens are likely to pick up, Murray Rankin's now or soon to be vacant seat in Victoria. The Greens were second place in 2015, and without a popular incumbent, there's a good chance they take that. A few other ones, South Island, that are traditionally NDP. Maybe they even pick up a couple of Metro Vancouver. It starts to be a real possibility for them to get a solid block of probably former NDP seats.
It'll definitely be one place we'll be following closely as we close in on the election in the fall. But while we're talking about elections, there was one over in Newfoundland today, and darn it if another province isn't super excited to have a minority government. It's all the rage now. Ontario and Quebec missed their chance. So did Alberta. But just like PEI, New Brunswick, and here in good old British Columbia, Newfoundland now has technically a minority government. So Newfoundland had a Liberal government majority prior to this, led by Dwight Ball. They have 40 seats in their legislature. Today, the Liberals managed to snatch 20 of those, which is exactly half. So if they have to put up a speaker, they no longer have a majority and need to rely on one of the other.
But hey, there's now just a whole bunch of very constitutionally nerdy speaker takes that people can reference back to.
For I think the third time, because New Brunswick had almost the same situation.
Yes.
The progressive Conservatives in Newfoundland, who were polling very close and actually got 1% less than the Liberals, ended up with 15 seats. The Liberals got 44% of the vote. The progressive Conservatives got about 42.6%. The Newfoundland New Democrats, who only ran in 14 of the province's 40 constituencies, I think they'd switched leaders within the last 6 months and were widely discredited and believed to be facing electoral wipeout, actually gained a seat and are now represented by 3, I think it's MHAs, I want to say. It's not MLAs.
What would be the H in there?
Member of the House of Assembly? It's weird. I know it's not MLA.
Could be MPP?
there's 3 New Democrats anyway. And to round out the Newfoundland legislature, there are 2 independents elected who I think are both ex-Liberal Party members. So now the question is, will either of them defect back or work with their former party? Or will they try and team up with the rest of the opposition to create an equally unstable government or force another election in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Well, either way, the provinces really seem to like going for the Matt's chaos scenarios recently.
I think the max chaos might have been if someone from the Newfoundland Alliance Party, who ran 9 candidates, might have run. As far as I can tell, they were another populist wannabe party of just radical hodgepodge of ideas. They didn't manage to sneak in. But I think the fact the Newfoundland NDP grew their party, and it's still a small party, is something that just got missed by a lot of the people who were covering it. I know even Drew Brown, who's now working for an independent newspaper out there, he focused on the whole thing as a needless election between the Liberals who had no new ideas and the Progressive Conservatives who didn't really have any ideas either. And the whole thing was a mess. And it looks like now they have a mess of a result. So this also ends up meaning that PEI, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland have all decidedly moved away from Liberal majority governments when in 2015, all 4 maritime East Coast provinces, I'm going to get in trouble if I say the wrong one, Atlantic provinces,
because Newfoundland is not a maritime province.
There we go, that's it. All 4 Atlantic provinces voted all Liberals to the federal government, and the question is whether Justin Trudeau can hold on to that red eastern fortress, or if he's inevitably going to lose some to Conservatives in some of the traditional Conservative seats. Maybe the NDP breaks back through, although their polling numbers aren't great on the East Coast.
Their polling numbers really aren't great anywhere, except kind of BC.
And maybe the Greens manage to sneak in Charlottetown. So, East Coast, also a place to watch this October.
Well, one of the leaders wanted to cut a swath through that Liberal stronghold is Andrew Scheer, who earlier today pitched a coast-to-coast energy corridor.
Andrew Scheer was laying out the second of, I guess, his 5 policy speeches. Last week we talked about his foreign policy / defense approaches, and now it's his energy platform. The big idea is this dedicated energy corridor from coast to coast to make sure we can get pipelines built, electric transmission lines, or any major infrastructure projects like that by essentially just having the government get a stretch of land across the country to connect coast to coast so that companies, anyone wanting to build something to get something across the country, doesn't need to go through an arduous process every time. I actually kind of like the idea. I don't really care about building additional pipelines. I think it's a dying industry and we need to kill it faster. But improving the electrical grid is something Jagmeet Singh actually talked about in his leadership campaign. I think he called it like an electric super grid or something. They're wonky, nerdy ideas, but the idea is just having a better electrical transmission system. So BC and Quebec and Ontario, clean hydro and nuclear energy, can get to provinces that don't have that capability, and we share the resources a little bit better. And making sure we can build those quickly and efficiently, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what problem this corridor is trying to solve exactly, because, different types of projects have different environmental impacts, so you can't just do a one-size-fits-all thing right away, and then doesn't resolve the title issues, so that's going to be a problem. There will inevitably be court battles between the First Nations and the Government of Canada over this. It's hard to see exactly what this is trying, or what specific program it's trying to solve, or specific problem it's trying to solve in that sense.
He did have other ideas in his platform. Most notably, he wants Canada to get off foreign oil by 2030 because we shouldn't be importing from human rights abusers like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, according to Andrew Scheer. And he cited the U.S. as a country that imports no oil, which Global News helpfully pointed out is factually false.
They're a net exporter, but they do definitely import oil. And just as we're, I believe, a net exporter, but the Atlantic provinces import their oil because it's easier to bring a tanker to the refinery in St. John than it is to get the oil from Alberta to there.
Well, maybe once we have our energy super corridor, we can get oil.
Even so, like, ships are really good at moving large amounts of anything, so I'm not actually sure the economics on that one shape out. Also, like, isn't this supposed to be the free trade party? Like, why is oil, like, the one thing that, like, gets super well, this is also dairy. Why is it one of the few things that suddenly gets super protectionist?
Because Alberta, anytime you have a major industry that has essentially bought our politics, they're going to get a lot of favoritism. Now, ironically, Scheer has also talked in his speech about ending corporate handouts, which sounds like a noble goal, but I am highly skeptical of any government that claims that will happen.
Corporate handouts such as to corporations in the dairy industry, for example? He does specifically cite Bombardier in this, which is a bolder stance than I thought, considering hasn't always taken that approach to Bombardier and has been playing for Quebec seats.
The one last thing I do actually like in here is that he would go and kill the Liberals' infrastructure bank. This is their approach to trying to spur investment in public construction, a good thing in my book, but by trying to do it through public-private partnerships and other ways of essentially subsidizing private actors to do what, frankly, governments should often just be doing, like building highways or airports. And in some cases, these P3s end up just costing a lot more than if the government had just took it on. Essentially, it's the government covering all the risk for companies, but reaping far less of the rewards. So I don't know what he would replace the infrastructure bank with in terms of ensuring that we do continue to build the infrastructure that we'll need, especially if we want to transition this world eventually. Doesn't sound like we're getting a environmental plan, though, from Scheer, which brings us to the final element, which is, of course, to scrap the federal carbon tax.
Boo.
Yeah. So overall, not many big surprises from Scheer. Some, ideas I didn't expect, but they're still largely on brand.
Yep.
But where Scheer has a big focus on oil and killing the carbon tax, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP spent this week pushing opposition to climate change harder than they have for a while, almost like they just lost a by-election to the Green Party and need to up their bona fides. The NDP dropped a motion in the House of Commons this week calling for the House of Commons to declare a climate emergency, to up its carbon reduction plans, and Jagmeet Singh actually started coming out against liquefied natural gas, which puts him now at odds with the BC NDP because, the NDP can never all get along. And if he was previously at odds with Rachel Notley, he needs a new party to pick on.
He came out against fracking in an interview and then dodged a bunch of questions about the specific BC LNG project. So it was it was a bit of a bomb of an interview. It does signal that he's shifting to try and shore up the green flank of the party, but it also risks losing the kind of blue collar sector of the NDP base.
Yeah,
who, wants jobs building those LNG plants.
Sounds like he's still a bit short on details. He has talked about retrofitting every home in Canada by 2050, I believe, and spending some money to do that.
Well, you'd have to. That's a pricey proposition.
That or it's 500,000 homes, but it's quite a bit, which is a noble goal and one that should be part of a climate strategy. But retrofit all the homes is not something anyone's yelling in the streets when they're talking about climate emergencies. It sounds like more details will be coming, but in the meantime, Trudeau also introduced the Liberal motion to declare a climate emergency this week, and so he's still at risk of having these calls usurped by either the Greens, who have credibility on the issue,
or even some of their stuff isn't super great. Earlier this week, Elizabeth May was on the radio talking about what the Greens want to see, and just some a lot of it was kind of the Teslas in every an electric car in every garage and a solar panel on every roof sort of thing, which okay, that's better than what the status quo is, but it's not exactly the big things we should really see. If the Greens are serious, they need to shift their policies around nuclear power, for example, and focus in on land use problems, which electric cars are better than gasoline cars, but it's still fundamentally inefficient to try and haul a couple thousand kilograms of metal around just to transport a single person, regardless of the power source.
Yeah, it's why The moves Vancouver is making are very admirable, and I encourage everyone to listen to the latest episode of Canby Report that has 2 interviews Patrick did on these kind of questions of what kind of shifts should we be making. At the federal level, I think the NDP still has an opportunity here, not to go down the like Green New Deal type program, but something akin to that, akin-ish to LEAP, but again with less terrible branding and just
terrible ideas too. There was a lot of like.
But to get back to your point of needing to couple the blue-collar worker and the environment together, that's the kind of approach the NDP, even if the specifics need to be worked out, it needs to be something that talks about how the government can fund a transitional program, as it were, as one Trotsky might say, but to make us a more green society. And that is a kind of plan the NDP could put forward that I think could get some people excited, but they just are still spinning their wheels a bit. I know you want to rant about the LEAP, but I know
I'll save the rant for another time. But yeah, there's a lot of, for every good climate idea in there, there's just a bunch of other traps surrounding it, and we can do better, a lot better. And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. If you're a first-time listener, make sure to subscribe and let us know what you think. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politicos. If you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Sherson Plotnikoff. Thanks for listening.